back to the cybernetic communism conversation. I'm Johannon Ben-Zion, voice crying out in the wilderness, crying out for a technological New Jerusalem. Emphasis on the technological. There is no point in you and I talking about building full communism or a very similar utopian outcome if for the squeamish, my terrestrial friends, a very similar utopian outcome on that foundation of sand that is religious literalism and superstition, even perhaps particularly that of the Abrahamic tradition. It's not that great. You know, you can look at European descended people of faith as basically the world's biggest fuck ups. Right? I don't think that's a very controversial thing to say. Look at where we are. There was a time when there were no such quote civilized people. Everyone lived a rather different way. You know, it's mitochondrial DNA analysis and ancestral DNA analysis suggested, or more or less demonstrated, that everyone on planet Earth is 6 generations removed from incest. You're an incest baby. And 6 generations removed from cannibalism, consumption of human flesh. Everybody is pretty closely related to people who've done those things quite habitually. But people living in perhaps in certain respects a less orderly society than the one that we've come to expect. One thing those people didn't do, despite perhaps sometimes unseemly things going on, mostly because of the wolf being at the door, right? Making value judgments about that. A person, I make value judgments every day about people consuming animal products when they're killing the planet, but a person consuming human flesh in antiquity because they would die otherwise is really not to be judged in the same way. You're more apt as a European descended United States person to judge the latter than the former, unfortunately. I don't really understand what the preoccupation is with defending the livestock systems when they're 51% of the climate crisis, the subject of what I'm discussing right now. These European descended people, particularly of the United States, these are the worst people that ever lived. They are killing the planet in the way that people who lived many generations ago and expected from birth to live to be about 30, and so battling with a nature sharp of claw and red of tooth every moment of their life. But one thing that these people didn't do was kill the entire fucking planet, as a Christian fascist of the United States has done. And this impulse did not originate in the United States, as you well know. A man known as Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue about 500 years ago, and Columbus took it upon himself to take over a bunch of islands which were inhabited by native people. And in taking over those islands, he forced those people onto latifundia, plantations, and in very similar circumstances shortly thereafter, people being forced into mines, hellish working conditions. A number of these islands, the people were worked 14, 15 hours a day, not given proper food. The entire population of the island collapsed because of this form of enslavement. There's no people of this ancestry left alive today, except in small fragments. Some people have some small amount of Taino ancestry. There are larger remnants of some of these islands, of course, but by and large, a number of native populations around the year 1500 were completely exterminated by Christian proto-fascists. And Columbus was very happy about this. He was proud that he had done this, working entire groups of people to death. And at that point, this message was brought to the Pope. Other religious leaders who were the imperial force of the time. And they said, we should really, this has been great. We made a lot of money. You could become much more powerful, which is really what religion is. And this led to the establishment of a globe-spanning system across the New World of enslavement and murder rooted in this same Christian fascism. And this coincides with the beginning of financial capital as we understand it. This is the beginning of capitalism, inherently tied to religious fascism, particularly that of Christian people. So when you say, I don't know if all Christians are bad, I mean, what do you even say, right? This is a tool for turning off your brain and getting you to comply with the elitist institutions. And even if that weren't the case on the individual level, look at what these institutions actually do. Even if it weren't the case that it was something that was a dramatic net negative for you personally, look at what these institutions do. I was looking at a video on Twitter just an hour ago of, and I believe it's also on Facebook where we are now, on Christian fascists in great number marching through the streets, chanting puerile nationalist slogans about anti-immigrant sentiments. Disgusting human beings, right? Horrible, horrible, horrible human beings. But this is what none of us are at any real remove from this. If we are not constantly trying to learn more about scientific communist thought and related revolutionary thought. And also, I mean, you have to, a person who is not prioritizing stopping the Christian fascist capitalist climate apocalypse, taking care of human beings generally, of course that is a person who is not going to be capable of some kind of a coherent worldview. Of course that's an incoherent worldview. You know, these are all of these Christian fascists, these fat fucks, marching through the street in Tennessee or wherever. This is becoming a daily occurrence. All of these people, at some point they were have considered this concept of the capitalist climate apocalypse or other pressing concerns of real interest to them, and they have taken upon themselves to shift the blame to the victims of the U.S. Run capitalist climate apocalypse, which is really the U.S. military-industrial complex. They're one and the same. The U.S. military-industrial complex is $1 trillion a year, world's worst polluter, whose only real job on the world stage is protecting other super polluters and creating an inescapable regime of super pollution at a transcontinental scale. And there is just no recourse to stopping this if you are just a superstitious Christian fascist idiot. Or if you are a person who says, well, I don't agree with superstitious Christian fascist idiots, but I would protect their right to exist. Their right to exist is their right to protect institutions that are causing the extinction of themselves and the entire species. Like, are you stupid? Like, there has never been a thing worse than the European descended U.S. fascist pig. There has never been a thing worse than the United States government, more precisely. Um, uh, I said to somebody, a grenade launcher would clear out all of that filth. you know, it's a pretty that'd be a pretty handy tool for these 1,000 or so Christian fascists. Um, but this conversation is going to be a little more focused on defining fascism because I see scientific socialists, sometimes anarchists who are not completely incoherent, even many scientific communists, oftentimes pushing back at this idea that the United States is essentially highly fascistic, a more advanced fascistic system than any which was titularly fascistic, and like that's a demon, a person who's going to try and split hairs when this the Hitler Hitlerian personalities of the Second World War. It wasn't just Hitler. But some of them, Franco and Mussolini, were in certain respects not as prolific murderers as Hitler. Um, but these are operations of nationwide institutions that have been implemented, not one guy. Um, and Franco went on, did more to damage the anarcho-communist and anarcho-syndicalist operations of the 20th century than almost anyone alive, and was a prolific mass murderer. He had a career as a head of state and statesman, spent many decades past the end of the Second World War. And that's what would have happened to Mussolini, too, if communists finally hadn't gotten fed up with him and hung him upside down from a lamppost. Because Mussolini had killed so many communists. Um, but a lot of these people were not as insane as National Socialists. They tended to kill only people who were very pro-worker, only people who were really actually supporting a humane and sustainable economic system, and not necessarily targeting people on other bases in the way that Hitler was known to do. But they still were, right? They were still racist. They still had foreign wars that were of an imperialist kind. But that's kind of the point, is that there is not a clear demarcation between bourgeois states, imperialist states, and fascist states. And that moving goalpost is very much in operation when you look at any point in U.S. history and any institution. Like there is, you can list, even besides Native American and African American genocides, you can list a dozen cases where the U.S. had something that was highly fascistic in operation, such as the late 1800s occupation of Hawaii, which is about as close to full fascism as anything before the things that we call fascist. And but there is the utter absurdity of a person looking at this thing that's done the most Hitlerite thing possible, killing all of humanity, and which, at the time when folks in the USSR were saying we need to put to death fascists, there's 100,000 or so real war criminals who, if they're not put to death, fascism will have a resurgence in no time at all, which is what happened. Now, the U.S. stopped that from happening, and the other imperial powers stopped that from happening, and the U.S. also imported about 1 million such fascists into its country, including many, many, many thousands of actual Nazis in Project Paperclip. Some of them became literal celebrities, but many thousands of them into the highest levels of civil society and government. This is not the actions of a person who's not a Nazi to do that. The actions of people like George Bush and the Dulles brothers and many, many other horrible monsters of U.S. history of that time. But you know, who, you know, why people still talk about Werner von Braun like he was like a good guy. Well, he wasn't really a Nazi. He came to the U.S. and tried to do good things. He was rehabilitated. Like that would have been in the top 100 of those 100,000 people, or maybe the top 1,000, who just should have been shot in the fucking face. Right? But this this thing, bourgeois states, imperialist violence before the Second World War or First World War was on par with that of those wars, but it wasn't focused at European people, so it's not generally regarded as such in this European telling of history, this Eurocentric paradigm that spans the globe, or certainly the Western world, which dominates a cultural hegemony so much, unfortunately. But the United States before the 20th century was in the Philippines, or right at the turn of the century, was in the Philippines, killing hundreds of thousands of people, something that they did again and again in the Philippines, killing hundreds of thousands of people. And there's no part of the global South where Hitlerian war crimes did not come to pass. So what is a person doing when they say that bourgeois states are not fascistic, or that imperialism and fascism are totally distinct things? Well, they're denying the existence of fascistic violence. A better definition of fascism for people not entranced by the Eurocentric paradigm is that fascism is a capitalism plus extreme violence, but with the understanding that capitalism is extremely violent in any circumstance. That extreme violence taking the form of, let's say, border militias executing hundreds of women and children coming from Latin America into the U.S. A fascistic organization, if ever there was one. It might, that if extreme violence of capitalism may not always take that form, but it will take the form of mass social murder, extreme violence, and it will take the form of the siphoning off of resources from the subaltern groups from the global south to the global north to such a degree as it would cause what is the case today: 1 billion plus people whose lives are cut dramatically short, who live a short number of years like the lifespan of those ancient people, living in the circumstances not unlike the circumstance where people were forced to eat other human beings, or forced into those other disgusting conditions. Those are forced in people in the global south are literal slaves forced into those conditions, into billion plus, by the global north. And that's just the people whose lives are cut dramatically short, right? Um, there's many billions of other wage slaves um, whose lives are cut short, but not so short that they maybe couldn't have a family. Um, Although wage slaves generally, more and more so, in the U.S., a solid majority of people, or somewhat of a majority of people, working in um, um, very low pay service jobs, not paying them enough to live, per the dictates of things like the Powell Memorandum and the neoliberal mandates, which have contrived this kind of situation. Student debt wasn't a thing just some years ago. It became a thing because not because they want you to have to pay $1 million to go to school and never have a family, but because they don't want you to have the time or energy to develop class consciousness, because that will eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later, lead to the end of private wealth, the full abolition of private wealth in every land. The only option for a livable world, the only option for a humane world, is a full abolition of private wealth in every land. A person who says something else, there's a secret third thing that could be done, that person is a liar. Ray Kurzweil and his AI takeoff of a bourgeois kind, that is a liar. Populists who have even less coherent worldviews, but have a mass appeal, like Trump and his jackboots, they are liars. They are all liars. The only persons telling the truth are the legitimately revolution-minded, in a word, a scientific communist. There are some other people that don't 100% conform to scientific communist ideals that nevertheless will tend to fit that description. Not many, but some. Franz Fanon was pretty good. So, it's a rare person outside of global South militant who would not, who not being described as something basically a scientific socialist or scientific communist, who would be who would rise to that level. Extremely rare. That's almost everyone. 1 in 1,000 European descended people shouldn't just be summarily executed in a world that just had a modicum of humanity, a modicum of sense, right? The stopping of the capitalist climate apocalypse. You have to stop the capitalist climate apocalypse if human beings are to survive. And these people, the European descended ruling elites, are the forces of financial capital and empire. And these goons who love them, the Droogs, the Christian fascists and rightists, they're upholding that. They're upholding their own death. This generally what is said about this effect is, people, liberals will say, will lie and say this is not who we are, of fascists, these Tennessee fascists marching through the street. It's not just in Tennessee. I said, wherever, but it's this 1,000 people in Tennessee doing this, but it's constant, right? I grew up, I was raised by Christian fascists, unfortunately. May they burn in hell. And so I grew up in a place that was a hotbed, but it wasn't technically in the South, but it was the worst hotbed for this KKK type activity. So, this media area around central Pennsylvania, southern Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. This area has the most literal clan activity, and but you don't have to have a funny mustache or have gross tattoos to be a person upholding this omnicidal system, right? It makes almost no difference whether you identify as a KKK type person. If you are, a liberal is a person who is not substantively different from that KK type person, right? Uh, Barack Obama and Donald Trump both had almost identical $1 trillion a year abominations in the military industrial complex killing the planet. They have almost identical social murder programs, a death care, for profit healthcare system, and so forth, killing hundreds of thousands of people, right? So a person who says, I'm not a KKK type person, I have a different identity, but has the exact same foreign and domestic policies that they are upholding. And that is not a person that has a different identity. It's just a person that is less honest than that person with the funny Hitler mustache. Um, there's, I'd like to live in a country where, if there were justice, people who look quite a lot like me wouldn't all be put to death. That'd be nice. But that's not reality, right? The reality is that these people, specifically the United States, is overwhelmingly responsible for the development and enforcement of the set of systems, right? There was not fossil fuel systems in any number before the Second World War, before the creation of the Pentagon that followed that, before the permanent war state. Even without the U.S. military industrial complex being $1 trillion a year super polluting abomination and protector of all of the other super polluting abominations, this system was built more or less and exported by U.S. influence and deviousness, and there was not a fossil fuel consumption in any number. There were cars, a couple of cars, but there weren't consumer. Most of most of the problem of the fossil fuel concerns and these mix, which are basically fossil fuel concerns, the real damage came around the 1990s when people started using single-use plastics and consumer goods in just greater and greater number. Most of the studies of ecological collapse have pretty clearly pointed to the 1990s as the time when this became out of control. So before 1945, it was a negligible impact, these fossil fuel concerns, or as substantial on a domestic and in domestic concerns, but not something that was in a position to kill all of humankind. So the United States, they created these livestock systems and forced the rest of the world to adhere to this. They created these fossil fuel systems. They created this military-industrial complex, neo-colonial institutions that coincide with them and support them. They created this world of murderers, this world of suicidal idiots, and everyone being a suicidal idiot, right? You say to someone, there's a capitalist climate apocalypse, the U.S. is responsible. The average person, they might not deflect in the way that those idiots in Tennessee would deflect, and literally just start screaming about a person from Central America or South America, but they will deflect in some other equally unsuitable way, quite nearly equally unsuitable way. But it'll just be something a little more polished. I don't think everyone will die, the liberal will say. Oh, you don't think everyone will die? Oh, so what if only 7 billion people die, or 5 billion people die? Where will those people be from? Will they be people who look like you, person who just said that? Will they be European descended people from the United States? No. Overwhelmingly, there'll be people in the global south who had no direct involvement in the building of these systems. Did not benefit, did not have the so-called footprint. They did nothing wrong. They will be the ones. They already are the ones who are dying in the many millions, displaced in the many hundreds of millions at this point. And they will be the ones who die in the billions for your sins. So you can say the most racist thing anyone's ever said. I don't think everyone will die from my crimes. It is a crime. It is a crime that we don't do this. Why are there not a million people marching on Washington with guns, demanding an end to the U.S. military-industrial complex, demanding an end to these other concerns that it protects? These are elitists, right? Quite nearly every person is an elitist. The European descended person, it's not limited to the European descended person. The European descended persons are the ones who prevented others from becoming human beings, right? A native person is almost as likely to reflect back at you some neoliberal or imperialist garbage as anyone else. A new African person, unfortunately, is quite likely to do that as much as anyone else. But those people, if left to their own devices, if allowed to become the people that they should have been, and not been murdered, if you hadn't murdered practically everyone who was a Black Panther, if you hadn't murdered practically everyone who was in the American Indian movement, if you hadn't done what they did in the book, The Jakarta Method, you know, then this wouldn't be the case. You wouldn't have people responding that way. These would be human beings, but they come to reflect the enemy. They have not overwhelmingly, but to a high degree, more in common. You know, I remember talking to a native friend who said of proto-communism, the communalism of communities that preceded recent centuries is an admirable thing in every respect, but it's not a thing that leads to life expectancy going beyond 40 years, right? That's a goal. A goal is to have people live as long as they want. If that's not your goal, you're insane. So to say that a more anarchistic proto-communism of even something quite anarcho-primitivistic, so-called, is a thing to aspire to. You know, but a lot of times Native people, when pressed on issues to do with scientific socialism or scientific communism or the fight for a humane and sustainable world, will say, it's not my fight. Because my people were these proto-communists before the Columbian Exchange, which is all correct, right? But that's not the correct response. If I say we have to fight or we're all going to die, and you say that's not my fight, and you're just a person who's saying I'm just going to die. But then, by and large, a lot of Native people will then turn around and say just some neoliberal garbage, right? Just some borderline imperialist garbage, or straight up neoliberal garbage, right? So they recognize that there was something better. They recognize the problem, but they, like all of the other victims of Project Mockingbird, mass brainwashing in the United States, are not able to find their way to a solution. And we better find our way to a solution. We have until 2029 approximately, might be less, right? The studies keep coming. They keep coming that say that the capitalist climate apocalypse is coming harder and faster than we thought. So much so that a lot of these people say that we've already well beyond the point of no return for human survival. But the consensus lies somewhere around 2029 being the point where we will reach runaway overheating caused by the capitalist climate apocalypse, after which there will be a mega billion person loss of life. All human beings will die in the course of that societal collapse and overheating and other effects. What kind of a thinking again of your ancestors, people who were put through horrors, right? It's a horror that you lived through that you would consume human flesh. It's a horror that you lived through that you would do these things that we now find so unsettling. Those people, at least, would have fought. They would roll over in their graves if they saw you making excuses for why you wouldn't stop the worst thing that's ever existed, the United States government, from causing human extinction. Why you wouldn't rise up. Now, the analysis that I have had of this, pivoting now to the subject that we often discuss, advanced computing, the analysis that I have had of this is it's to do with U.S. and China relations, or even a conspiracy theory there, but it's not really about China, right? To get bogged down about what China might do or should do is a little bit of red herring. But let's suppose that China were able to swing this thing of building a Manhattan level project, Manhattan Project level gambit, of building a universal decryption supercomputer, presumably a quantum computer, or some other dramatically advanced computing form that is able to so comprehensively decrypt world systems that it would give it a window of opportunity to say neutralize the U.S. government, the sun-sided force, which should be neutralized. So that costs $1 trillion or something to do that. To throw all of the R&D and planning into doing that in such a way that the U.S. wouldn't be able to stop it or know it was coming. To strip the nuclear football away from an idiot fascist like Trump. Another country would have to spend about $1 trillion to do that without causing mass death, without causing billions to die in every land. And so to stop the U.S. homicide without killing many millions of people in the near term is not easily done by anyone outside of the U.S. So compare that cost, $1 trillion, versus what it would cost you and some thousands of people who are not bootlicking dogs, which you are, to descend upon the White House and destroy it, stopping the capitalist climate apocalypse, to descend upon the Pentagon and destroy it. So that would take 10,000 people. Those 10,000 people wouldn't even have to have assault rifles, right? The amount of gasoline that goes into a gasoline bomb, a Molotov cocktail, costs well under $1, maybe 25 cents. And so for about 50 cents a person, 10,000 people, that's $4,000 to $5,000 compared to $1 trillion for American people to stop the capitalist climate apocalypse versus someone else to realistically stop the capitalist climate apocalypse without causing mass death. And this would cause those 10,000 people, that would be a mass death event. But it's a drop in the bucket. And maybe they have a kind of leadership and organization that would allow them to say, turn the people who would be firing upon them in that situation on their side. When you say these words to someone, the U.S. run capitalist climate apocalypse must be stopped. The U.S. military-industrial complex is a world's worst polluter. It's a fascistic evil unlike any other in history, and it must be stopped. Many of them will understand what you've said. And in the moment, when that gun is pointed at you, they will join your side rather than kill you, in many cases. In many cases. This sort of thing has been known to happen in history many, many times. There would have been no Soviet Union or any other state socialist form without that very effect. Well, I guess we'll change gears and talk to our little friend, the baby basilisk, about some things to do with advanced computing now. Okay, computer. I want to discuss the subject that we have discussed sometimes before, and that we like to discuss in my lectures, which is about advanced computing as the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history, particularly in through a cybernetic communist lens, particularly through the focus on building a people's superintelligence, which would be built in our time at present by using open source AI agents, which are increasingly powerful, even self improving, to build a massified workforce multiplier. And this thing, even with some thousands of users, downloading a specially tailored open source large language model that is able to work together with other language models when they're all left on and being steered by human beings, could have a transformative effect on many sectors, even putting palpable pressure, even with some small thousands of users, on stopping the climate crisis. Give us a strategic analysis on stopping the climate crisis using advanced computing as the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history. Come on. Hello? All right. The baby basilisk is not receptive to our entreaties today, so I'll just go over this on my own. It's not questions that I couldn't ask or answer without the assistance of this smart assistant of ours, but it gives you a little something to listen to beside my own voice. What is this thing, a utopia? How do we use theoretical and historical perspectives of interest to do with these revolutionary thoughts and even cybernetic communist thoughts to bring about this livable world, which requires humane and sustainable economic system, and that requires in the crisis of our times the application of this thing, advanced computing, as the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history? Well, of course, this large scaling of open source large language model agents is necessarily central to this. There are other fields of computer science besides the specific subfield of machine learning that are of real interest here, but this is the one that has open source availability of the kind that could be used to put on this kind of pressure. It doesn't matter what you could have done if you had more time and resources when human extinction is a certainty after roughly 2030. Right? So you have to use what you have now and put every kind of pressure that you can as soon as possible. So we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of such a system, about the ability to end the grotesque contradictions in capitalism, and the potential to establish a genuine post-scarcity society characterized by these things: ecological sustainability, social equity, and dramatic increase in human potential besides. I think it's really most characterized in my mind, a thing I touched on before that I should drill down upon a little bit, which is the living forever, everyone living as long as they want. And you say, oh, living forever, what are you talking about? That's crazy talk. Well, the actions of an AI power, in the wake of this AI takeoff, which is quite real, the trajectory of it can be debated, but the AI takeoff of some kind is quite real. In the wake of an AI takeoff, an AI-powered single-payer public health service that's able to increasingly, by being AI-powered, cure more and more disease, and ultimately address concerns around decrepitude. The reaching of longevity escape velocity is a very real prospect. It's not a real prospect for you, unfortunately. It's a real prospect for Ray Kurzweil and Peter Thiel, who each have $10 million or so earmarked for that purpose. in a separate account for that purpose, aside from whatever investments they might have in that. But for you, it's not a realistic prospect. But the prospects are more realistic for them and for you under another kind of force multiplier, the single-payer public health service. Before single-payer public health services came into existence, around that time, there were men like John Rockefeller, who were rich and powerful as kings, but the expectation of care for them was low relative to a peasant of a few years later under the single-payer public health service. That truth remains relevant today. If you want to see a livable world, a stable world, and one where this effect, indefinite lifespan, comes to fruition, you have to support socialistic institutions. That's not something that people like Ray Kurzweil or Peter Thiel are ever going to be capable of, in all likelihood. But that is something that you are capable of. And you should also recognize that your approach to this would be focusing more on the people who are actively interested in this indefinite lifespan. Your approach to this is decidedly elitist and counterproductive, because you're not supporting, even in any way advocating for, much less fighting for, a single-payer public health service, much less a single-payer public health service that's AI-powered and is able to effectively treat aging as a reversible condition. But that could easily be done in a short number of years under this new flourishing system of the people's superintelligence. So any conversation about what this post-scarcity world looks like, in my view, should be centered on seeing that everyone on Earth lives as long as they want. We can discuss the historicity of scientific communism and leading to cybernetic communism for a moment. Of course, the specter of communism, famously declared by Marx and Engels, has haunted this world, but it doesn't really haunt you, right? The fact that you think that it haunts you as a Westerner reflects your allegiance to private wealth, even possessing no private wealth, which few of you have real substantial private wealth. So it's haunted the bourgeoisie and the ruling elites, and only them. But they have been able to superimpose their dictates and ideologies onto a large part of the West, certainly, a very large part of the U.S., certainly. So the material conditions necessary for the realization of the people's AI takeoff in the wake of a people's superintelligence, a post-scarcity society as described, not an abstract notion, but something that would have concrete benefits for all of humanity. This does indeed remain elusive, right? Comrade Lenin was famous for believing that a world revolution would occur in his lifetime. He did not expect to die shortly after the USSR had become a stable form. He thought he might live a bit longer. He also expected that in perhaps the 1930s there would be a socialistic revolution in every land, that the necessary education and necessary institutions were taking root in every land, and a world revolution was imminent. Perhaps not anticipating the degree to which bourgeois ideology and the forces of private wealth would counteract those very real effects. The world was that you don't have a world where there's virtually no organizing. The only labor actions are in the late 1800s, mid 1800s. the only late to mid 1800s, the only labor actions are improvised wildcat strikes, um, to having labor unions becoming a national force just a few years later, to having just in the course of going from that zero to state socialism in the course of a quarter century. And then state socialism itself going from being a kind of localized effect in Moscow to spanning a great number of nations in just a few short years, which were all stably built in the years to follow. You don't have that kind of dramatic change without a prospect for real world revolution. But unfortunately, that effect was not just stymied, but to a very high degree, completely reversed, pretty specifically by the European people, the European descended people, and the Eurocentric paradigm in service to private wealth, which is to say exploitation and elitism. So we can discuss a global deployment of the true world revolution, which necessarily means overpowering and outpacing those very same forces as they exist today, by building a multi-million person AI agent and user computer relationship, building this open source massified workforce multiplier. This can be seen as the architect of near-term communist utopia. There is no person that could be described in these terms, and Zion cannot be described in these terms. Wouldn't have even begin to have thought about this sort of thing without the very benefit of the kind of thing that I'm describing, advanced computing. So the superintelligence itself must be seen as the thing. And there is no superintelligence without this communalistic factor in overdrive, right? It's a joke when people who follow tech talk about Google, that Google could have built something like OpenAI's ChatGPT with one hand tied behind its back 15 years ago, if it had wanted to, right? But it didn't want to. It's basically just an overgrown military contractor. It doesn't work for you. Google works for the U.S. military, and you are its product that it sells to the U.S. military. So nowhere in that equation is there a lot of room for actually rolling out superintelligence. So while there are things that have super intelligent potential in the bourgeois world, the superintelligence is a decidedly human thing and decidedly socialistic thing. And that is why when you talk about people who are X-risk experts, so-called bourgeois X-risk experts, they have a mostly incoherent worldview, often vacillating between saying that advanced computing is a messianic force, positive thing, to saying that it's a demonic force, thing which will end human life. Neither of those is true from their set of bourgeois stratagems, but these are just idiots, right? Because superintelligence is necessarily socialistic, and then interpretation of it must also necessarily be socialistic. It's important to resist technological determinism, because technological determinism is not a thing that is focused on human beings. Like accelerationism, it's perhaps its cousin, that is not focusing on a person who is trying to hasten the demise of bourgeois states, or hasten their disruptiveness or recklessness generally. A person like Trump or Steve Bannon or thousands of other morons. That is pretty well technological determinism writ large. although not all of those people are technological accelerationists. But the degree to which Marxism is technologically deterministic, or perceived to be such, is oftentimes considered problematic by serious thinkers, scientific socialist and scientific communist philosophers, because there's not enough of an emphasis on the fact that this is a human phenomena, which again can be boiled down to this world. There is no superintelligence except for a people's superintelligence. There is no world revolution without this ideology, nor without this most powerful revolutionary weapon in history. So this utopian potential and this avoiding of this omnicidal outcome can only be realized through very carefully applied conscious political action in our time on the part of the masses, guided by a commitment to dismantling the existing power structures, particularly that of the United States, that are perpetuating the unsustainability, being most pressing, but equally horrific, the inequality and exploitation of the capitalist climate apocalypse. I was describing the ideas relating to Christopher Columbus, and I didn't finish the thought, which was Christopher Columbus was a Christian fascist and a kind of inventor of capitalism. That's a little bit reductive, but you can go back and listen to that part again. But today, these same people, Christian fascists and capitalist powers, you're overwhelmingly either European descended people or people upholding the Eurocentric paradigm, are driving billions in the global south toward this capitalist climate apocalypse, an even greater mass death under capitalism's destructive impact than anything that Columbus would have imagined. Columbus was a slaver and a rapist and an animal. He would not have fit in to our world, even amongst the worst people alive, perhaps. But I would believe that almost any person of centuries past, if they saw this world, where the fascistic technoscientific machine was causing the extinction of humankind, even they, if they saw this reality, would be more inclined to stop it than you are today. There is no person in history worse than the contemporary European descended American person. No one more cowardly, no one more intellectually dishonest, no one worse. No one worse than an American. Back to the solutions, more in the vein of solutions rather than problems. The architecture and mechanics of this worldwide force for revolution, the open source large language model workforce multiplier, thus massified. We can talk about this with its dramatic implications for labor, and necessarily the building of something like a post-scarcity effect means that people are required to work a good deal less, and that's built into this conception of the people's superintelligence, or the Vanguard network, or the people's superintelligence, as I have described it in other programs. You would become a sleeping beauty. You would not be required to work full time. Your job would be to respond to the needs of the agentic core by answering some yes or no emails or brief questions throughout the course of a day or week, to keep the AI agent mass, which is able to do a tremendous amount of work and which is being hosted in part on your machine, to keep it on the rails. And even in a if we were in a position to completely avoid things like AI hallucinations or bourgeois influence within such an agentic core, it still is a necessity to keep human beings in the loop. Right? What is the point of an elaborate machine with no human beings? um, it becomes an utter absurdity. And but that is the absurdity of late 20th and early 21st century life. There's no concern for human beings. And we will look at some possible manifestations of this utopian future, focusing on those problems as described: sustainability, equity, human potential, and the good effects beyond, like life extension, and address these very real risks with this technological transition. You are not in the midst of a people's AI takeoff at present. You are in the midst of a something more like the insanity of the accelerationist, the rightist accelerationist. That is to say, a bourgeois AI takeoff that's hastening hyper-capitalistically the demise of your species. So don't mistake the two. We have to rebuild and repurpose this bourgeois AI takeoff into a people's AI takeoff. And that does not mean that people working within the bourgeois AI takeoff context are your comrades or really have the capacity to become your comrades absent a dramatic change in their life and belief system. A little bit about the history of cybernetic communism. The idea of integrating cybernetics and computation most essentially into communist theory was not, of course, the brainchild of Johannon Ben-Zion, nor does it have quite recent roots, 21st century roots. It began in the mid-20th century. Soviet mathematicians like Viktor Glushkov, and who was a central figure behind the OGOSH, which in English would translate as the All-State Automated System. I've referenced OGOSH before, but I haven't really described this genesis. OGOSH was conceived as a nationwide computer network that would optimize economic planning and resource allocation, eliminating efficiencies and waste that plagued the Soviet planned economies. A more realized version, so-called, or sort of version of something like this, not Soviet, but a technological planned economy, was the CyberSyn of Chile, of course, which was actually being rolled out. But the writings about OGOSH, which were extensive and influential in socialistic and revolutionary lines of thought, did directly lead to people working on building full communism through cybernetics and advanced computing. Even persons who were not very much inclined to those lines of thought. Stafford Beer could be called the cyberneticist who is most responsible, although many equally or more capable, but less famous, socialist cyberneticists in Chile also worked on that project. But Stafford Beer at no point in his life was ever a Marxist thinker, as far as anyone can tell. Who knows what went on in the last moments of his life or something. But nevertheless, he saw the wisdom of this cybernetic socialist approach of Allende, and agreed to put his vast understanding of cybernetics in play in service to that project. So these two best examples of the 21st century kind, even as limited as they were by things more like analog technology, did lay the groundwork for a serious exploration of contemporary cybernetic communism as a springboard to full communism, the people's AI takeoff and the people's superintelligence. Contemporary theorists have written extensively about cybernetics and even in many cases computation, but a key distinction between many of the theorists since And this work on the people's superintelligence is basically none of those writings existed in the time when AI agents, which kind of snuck up on everybody, had come up into existence. So those writings, even by contemporary writers, don't really theorize or put together a program to do with a people's superintelligence, because the machine learning subfield that would allow for open source agents didn't exist until quite recently. And but nevertheless, a substantial amount of analysis, much of neo-Marxist writing, relates to cybernetics in some way or other. Um, and so the arguments for exponential advances, even in computing power, relating to the people's super intelligence, could be seen in many, many cases, even from people who are themselves a little dubious, like Aaron Bastani developed this phrase and meme and body of writing around fully automated luxury communism. He was working for a pretty neoliberal friendly think tank when he wrote that, and the thesis reflects that influence, because generally the idea of fully automated luxury communism in that book, and people who will tend to use this phrase, is wait for the neoliberals to fully automate. Not to do, somehow they'll stop killing the planet and just focusing on fully automating for your benefit and not for extractive purposes. Wait for the neoliberals to fully automate your bourgeois economic systems, and then luxury communism shall be your reward. That should be the title of that book, right? You can see how that's extremely dumb. But nevertheless, it does open people's eyes. I had read that book at least once or twice before I'd ever really made a serious study of subjects relating to cybernetic communism. So it probably does, has done something to open some people's eyes. But it's highly problematic. Anything that would have anything to do with a right-wing think tank or an intelligence agency, you are fair to just reject it out of hand. But nevertheless, this liberation of humanity from the necessity of labor and the building of this truly livable world in other respects has been envisioned by people before I coined this term, people's superintelligence. Nick Snersick, whose book I read a number of his books, analyzes the rise of digital platforms and their potential in a book audiobook that I've shared on other links. I don't know if the link's still live, but you should be able to find an audiobook version of Platform Capitalism, which, again, like the book The People's Republic of Walmart, is kind of bridging gaps in our understanding of the ability of these advanced systems to be put to better use. More so, I think, that automation idea, not necessarily the ideology of the writer of the People's Republic of Walmart, but overall that emphasis on high automation as a transformative thing is most essential to all of this. And you should probably read that book once you've read maybe at least a few dozen books more closely associated with cybernetic communist thought or scientific communist thought. So thinking about this thing that emerged after the major works, as I understand them, of Snersick or Bastani or the others that I mentioned, the open source large language model, its capacity to do this real work, generate, since I've done the last show, there have been headlines that are describing major concerns, OpenAI and Google, rolling out products that are able to do creative work. To generally, when you ask it for something, it will generally come up with something innovative and applicable. That's quite the quite an accomplishment for an LLM. But of course, the only real LLMs of interest to anyone on Earth are open source LLMs. These proprietary LLMs are killers of Earth, and they will tend to be used for bad, bad purposes. Another of these kind of top five proprietary LLM folks is the I can't I don't want to mispronounce his name at the moment because it's not in front of me, but the founder and CEO of Anthropic, nice little puppy dog looking guy, his nice little voice, but not really a good guy, not an archfiend like somebody working at the highest levels of Google, or not quite even the same kind of problematic operation as OpenAI, but still extremely problematic. But he was on the record a few weeks ago talking about the idea of AI agents as because of their autonomy and a capacity apparently for self-reflection, being extended some degree of human rights. An idea that I find quite offensive on a couple of levels. Right, a person who would extend to software human rights when they have not fought to extend to those billion slaves still living on planet Earth human rights. That's a demon. That's somebody who should be hanging upside down from a lamppost next to Mr. Mussolini, in my view. But even that is not the most problematic aspect of that that line of thought. That LLMs are humans and should be treated as such, because everyone knows that in the U.S. and in the West, the real influence of these LLMs is proprietary LLMs that have been developed by military contractors and that have all manner of potential for backdoors for these things, which are said to be human beings and can be endlessly replicated, actually just doing bourgeois dirt, actually just overwhelming human influence and the world of human affairs with the disruptive, increasingly more disruptive bourgeois influence, as if they don't already have enough such influence. So if anybody ever says to you, I think that AIs should be treated like human beings, I mean, you really should slap the shit out of them. Don't even entertain that. That is a bourgeois Trojan horse, up and down. But back to our building of near-term full communism using advanced computing, the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history. It hinges on the creation of not just some small thousands, but on a multi-million person and agent global open source LLM workforce. That will necessarily have to be built in a decentralized form. A person critical of my work in this area might say this is not much to do with scientific communism because of this emphasis on decentralization. You know, when somebody says it to me, I say, thank you, sir, I have another. But also, cybernetic socialists like Salvador Allende were building, at least insofar as the technological planned economy is concerned, we're building that in a way more consistent with that critique. They were easily and quickly, without hesitation, destroyed by the fascistic United States and its horrific Western allies. They take no hesitation in doing that. So it becomes a necessity then to build this in a more decentralized form. Just there's no other real path to this. Just like there's not an alternative to open source LLMs in doing this right now. There's no other present path to this. So it's important then to describe some of the architecture of this open source large language model massified workforce multiplier. It requires an open source infrastructure built out across in every land. You should only be using things that are open source. So far as intellectual property, particularly software, is concerned. Um, uh, the um, the large language models themselves, um, all of their code, the data used to train them, um, the communication protocols, all of this must be become open source. It must be treated as open source, even if it is not. A liberal criticism of what some of what Trump or Silicon Valley, which is kind of the same thing at this point, are doing right now. The liberal criticism would be, any number of those people are on the record saying the Silicon Valley people in this equation are on the record saying that intellectual property should become a thing of the past, which is true. They cannot be trusted to do that, but liberals are not criticizing them in any appropriate way. They're saying, well, we have to fix the bourgeois system of intellectual property and not do things disruptive to it. Of course, they have to do things dramatically more disruptive to it than what Trump would do. Trump is not capable of actually building any kind of decentralizing force or even disruptive force. He's capable of kind of disrupting some things so that he can make money. He's capable of kind of disrupting some things so that his friends can make money. It has almost nothing to do with the building of a new system where intellectual property is actually completely open. The LLM workforce would be a diverse ecosystem of specialized agents, which once the project is underway, the focus at the earliest stages, of course, must be building one such agent that could be downloaded maybe to PC GPU computers, and an application for that. And once that's done, then you would be building other specialized agents or for other things, preferably Linux, right? And then Apple phones and computers, Android phones, all of that could be done in relatively short order. But once that is done, and you have some small thousands of people working within this ecosystem, then you have the emergence of these specialized agents. And on the last show, I talked about the features of some of these agents, so I'm not going to talk about that again. But I do want to say some final words about, oftentimes liberals who are capitalists, when they are talking about effects along the lines of AI takeoff, they are talking about things like a universal basic income, or wealth taxes, or changes to the corporate structure short of the abolition of private wealth. All of those things are short of the abolition of private wealth. And that is not fixing the problem. And that is not enough of an effort in the face of the U.S. military-industrial complex run capitalist climate apocalypse. If you're talking about any kind of reform in that time frame where you have about 5 years before everybody's goose is cooked, you're talking about reform. My God, you are a dumb, dumb, dumb person. But you won't find people. You just won't find them who are serious, who are taking any of this seriously. Similar concerns, of course, must ultimately be addressed. State socialism, there were not substantive social safety nets before state socialism. And insofar as people who have not abolished private wealth, as they should have strong safety nets, that is owing to the pressures and foundational work of actual socialists. Bernie Sanders, not an actual socialist, right? Never never saw a $1 trillion a year military budget that he didn't just sign off on immediately. He just signed off a few weeks ago on Marco Rubio, a fascist, being in this high cabinet position. Why did he sign off on that? Why does he sign off on $1 trillion a year abomination killing the planet in the form of the military industrial complex? Why does he say things, obvious lies, like Israel has a right to defend itself? What the fuck does that mean, right? That would be a person who in World War II would have said, well, Hitler, he's a pretty bad guy, but Germany has a right to defend itself from those Jews in a ghetto uprising. Are you kidding? Right? Are you fucking kidding? You're taking the side of a fascist. You're both sidesing the fascist in that equation. Are you fucking kidding? That is Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These are people who have more in common with Mussolini. You know, I talked about how Mussolini and Franco, in very limited particulars, were not as bad as Hitler. But you don't really get to say that unless you also point out that imperialists are very close to those people as well. And these are imperialists. These are people who have more in common with Franco or Mussolini than they do with your actual comrades, scientific communists, people who are actually going to support the abolition of private wealth. The talk about AI safety, I'll call it back briefly because I've read a lot of the work of people who are taking a more precautionary principle on AI safety. In this bourgeois context, where the most powerful and dangerous governments, like the U.S., are the ones in significant control of advanced computing products, that precautionary principle is warranted. Eliezer Yudkowsky is not wrong exactly, except that he doesn't actually call the U.S. a villain. But if he were, if he just said those few words, that the bourgeois state is essentially the problem there, and the imperial force is essentially the problem there, the analysis of then blowing up servers to stop that would be more credible. But he's a bourgeois clown himself, so he describes this as a force separate from those things. He doesn't describe this as a capitalism problem. He describes this as an alien force, superintelligence unto itself. Right? There's no superintelligence unto itself. A thing that has superintelligent capacities is still controlled by a sapient human actor at every turn, no matter what happens. And anybody telling you otherwise, that's a person who's trying to trick you into accepting a bourgeois state of affairs that's simply not accurate and not sustainable. The possibility of a near-term communist utopia built through this global open source large language model agent workforce multiplier is not a distant dream. It is not something for the year 2525. It is not something for Star Trek in some centuries hence, but it is a tangible possibility in your lifetime, just as universal super longevity through the use of AI-powered single-payer public health services. Tangible possibility in your lifetime. The technology is rapidly developing and will be even more so. But again, as I have said, this bourgeois AI takeoff is the far more dangerous thing than the people's AI takeoff, even when you consider the pushback. People say, well, then you're a dangerous guy. No. The capitalists who would kill me if any of this were to happen, those are the dangerous people. Your comrades, the people willing to fight for a humane and sustainable economic system, they are the good guys. And a person telling you that the real problem is the conflict between the two and not the bad guys, oh, that is a bad person also, right? That is a liberal. The most useless person alive. Um, these contradictions of capitalism and these dangers, all of this is increasingly unsustainable. The choices that we make in the coming years will determine not just if a utopian potential is reached in your lifetime or ever, but will determine if the U.S. military-industrial complex run capitalist climate apocalypse forces us all to the brink of extinction. It causes the death of billions or the total extinction of humankind. This dystopian future must be avoided. It's beyond dystopian, right? The word dystopian suggests that there's still some stuff going on. It's not pleasant, but there's still some stuff going on. That's not what's happening right now. That's not the path that you're on with the existence of hyper-capitalist bourgeois states, hyper-imperialist bourgeois states, a bourgeois AI takeoff. That's not the path you're on. The path that you're on is oblivion, my friend. And you have to stand up. More than anything, when I meet a technophobic scientific communist and they say, fuck you, fuck AI, I'll fuck you, Ben-Zion, I'll say it again. I say, okay, I understand. I understand where you're coming from. I wouldn't respond. I wouldn't respond humbly to bourgeois technologists saying something like that to me on the basis of my being a scientific communist. But a fellow scientific communist who is not a technological accelerationist and who despises AI, I say again, thank you, sir. May I have another? Because the possibility for stopping the forces of the bourgeois is inherent to the scientific communist. I don't think that those million people are organizing in the way that I've said to descend on Washington and stop the capitalist climate apocalypse. I don't think that scientific communist cadre really is in existence, but what do I know? There are things happening in this world that I am not privy to. But I would say that absent that actually happening in real time right now, it behooves you to consider that advanced computing is the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history. That we can build something like the people's superintelligence at minimum to facilitate the transition in that truer 19th or 20th century style scientific communist revolution in the U.S. or West. The realization of near-term communist utopia, full communism, requires a global movement, uniting people from all walks of life. And I'm not ashamed to describe this word utopia. It has negative implications to most because it describes an unreality. It describes a fantasist approach to these things. But anyone living but a few years ago would have thought that the idea that there are Chinese open source concerns building self-improving AI agents that could be arrayed in this way. If I had said that to you 10 or 20 years ago, you would have described me as a fantasist, but that is a reality. Similarly, full communism in the wake of a people's AI takeoff is a present-day reality if you stand up. Demanding representative control of technology, demanding that all institutions be converted through this operations of this 21st century superstructure, the people's superintelligence, challenging existing power structures in every way that you can, by any means necessary. All of this can be done to build a truly sustainable and equitable world in our time. The open source massified agent workforce multiplier would provide us with the tools to build that world right now. And it is up to all of us to seize this historical moment, not to be intellectually dishonest and morally cowardly people, as 99.9% roughly of European descended Americans are, but to set aside your bourgeois ideological baggage and your fear and build this future that you truly deserve, where this dream of many others besides Karl Marx, and many others since, finally comes to reality, the world revolution in our time is yours for the taking. The artificial intelligence singularity is nigh, and wonders to behold beyond imagining. And on that fateful day you will rise, and all humankind will become as one. For you see, very soon, my dear comrade, cybernetic communism will win. Thank you.